It started as a murmur, a story too audacious to accept within the silent hallways of Buckingham Palace. Assistants mentioned a monarch's order that might overturn generations of custom. The identity being spoken of wasn't William or Kate, nor was it Charles. It was Lady Louise Windsor. Not many beyond the royal sphere recognized the young lady fated to rattle the institution's core. Yet as the monarch's quill met the page, a different era started to take shape. During the quiet of that evening, a focus emerged, an interest that the opulent residence was unable to suppress. It commenced following a personal discussion held by King Charles with his most junior sibling, Prince Edward. The conference, despite being formally labeled a domestic talk, continued well beyond the midnight hour. Employees noted the soft reverberations of loud tones, the usage of documents, and a subsequent quiet so profound it seemed almost practiced. At dawn, Edward departed the residence, saying nothing, though acquaintances remarked his expression bore the burden of incredulity and fate. Quickly, gossip started to drift within the palace like unseen vapor. Attendants murmured that Charles intended to revive a designation rich in heritage, the Edinburgh lineage, formerly held by their deceased father, Prince Philip. Yet the element that stunned them was the person central to this determination, not Edward, as custom suggested, nor Anne, the relentless sibling who wore official obligation as protection. It was his offspring, the reserved, studious Lady Louise, who surprisingly emerged as the figurehead of a monarchical upheaval. Beyond the palace, the press started to detect the vibration preceding the shock. Journalists monitoring royal matters observed an oddity. Lady Louise's itinerary was abruptly voided, lacking any clarification. Her official engagements, formerly casual and infrequent, were discreetly erased from the monarchical schedule. Photographers positioned close to Windsor noted the presence of extra security details moving about her residence. A change was occurring, a purposeful joint maneuver to shield or maybe ready her for the imminent events. Inside the residence, a different sort of activity was developing, concealed in the records of official biographers. High-ranking aides happened upon a file marked Project Edinburgh. Its materials were protected intensely, secured by encoded pathways and limited entry. Yet the simple fact of the document's presence was sufficient to spark a whirlwind of conjecture. A few alleged it held King Charles's strategy for reshaping the line of inheritance. Others murmured it was a statement of principles, a formal proclamation of a revised monarchical system, founded not on lineage, but on worth and representation. The rumors arrived at the Queen Consort's ears quickly. Camilla's associates, never dismissing court maneuvering, started to investigate for information. Her loyal assistants depicted the Queen's behavior as composed yet frigid. She had endured controversies previously, but this situation was distinct. This did not concern her matrimony, public standing, or persona. It concerned authority. And authority within the monarchy has perpetually been a delicate legacy, quickly endangered and rapidly shattered. Yet amid the turmoil, a single reality stayed unvoiced. King Charles had ceased to just rule. He was intending to alter the very regulations of the institution. His incentives were ambiguous. Several claimed it was an homage to his deceased father, while others thought it his ultimate move to safeguard the dynasty's continuation. Yet under the veneer of formality and ceremony rested a more intimate, almost urgent drive, a compulsion to restore significance to the monarchy, and as murmurs became front-page news, and news transformed into questions nobody ventured to address, the institution readied itself for a threat unseen for ages: domestic insurrection masked as modernization. And as the dawn broke across Windsor the following day, the story ceased to be mere speculation. It had evolved into a monarchical judgment. For decades she remained unseen, the reserved offspring of Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. As her relations revelled in monarchical focus, Lady Louise observed from obscurity, her poise unrecognized and her ancestry undervalued. Yet destiny, it appears, was anticipating her opportunity, and that juncture came when Charles understood the institution's continuation could rely on the single royal who had never been genuinely perceived. From the start, Louise's existence was molded by intentional separation. Differing from her relatives, who matured under the unceasing scrutiny of the media, she developed in the softer quiet of the Windsor landscape, where the din of obligation yielded to the peace of obscurity. Sophie, her mother, undertook the task of protecting her child from the burden of monarchical demands. She knew precisely the cost of being seen, the criticism, the juxtapositions, and the constant encroachment. So she allowed Louise to mature discreetly, absorbing empathy prior to assurance, and humility before rank. That choice, previously challenged by the media, turned out to be predictive. As her peers perfected orations and rituals, Louise honed her awareness. She absorbed more than she articulated. She analyzed more than she postured. Individuals encountering her frequently noted her poise, a scarce equilibrium of adolescent kindness and subdued intellect. It was a trait that recalled for some her deceased grandfather, Prince Philip. Yet what was seldom understood was that Philip's influence persisted in her life through methods stronger than any could imagine. In the departed Duke of Edinburgh's personal documents, Charles had previously found a specific letter. It lacked a specific recipient, yet its phrasing held a clear meaning, a foresight penned by an individual with extraordinary perception. Philip had expressed thoughts on the Edinburgh lineage, an inheritance he wished would continue well beyond his time. He defined it not as an honor of entitlement, but of integrity, a bloodline founded on responsibility, self-control, and dedication to obligation.
An Edinburgh must perpetually exist, he penned, to prompt the monarchy regarding its core values. That phrasing resonated deeply with Charles. For decades, he contended with his father's looming presence, their conflicts, their separation, and the unattainable benchmark Philip's reserve had established. Yet in Louise, Charles perceived an element that both troubled and impressed him, the subtle manifestation of his father's essence, revived in an age group not marred by controversy. She embodied all the contemporary institution had overlooked, elegant yet sensible, dignified without arrogance. His esteem developed softly, almost defensively. He requested her presence at personal meals, solicited her views on philanthropic endeavors, and even pursued her insight on how the institution might connect with a new demographic. These instances, previously regarded as benevolence, matured into strong belief. For Charles, Louise was more than a relative. She was the personification of a lost monarchical standard, the equilibrium of compassion and integrity. However, the more his respect intensified, the more burdensome the awareness became, because in recognizing those qualities in her, Charles had to face the extent of the institution's divergence from them. The controversies, the competitions, the perpetual struggle for significance, all had eroded the respect the monarchy formerly held. Yet Louise, through her unpretentiousness, recalled for him its potential. This understanding held both promise and peril, as promoting Louise signified challenging monarchical norms, fracturing quiet pecking orders, and sparking rumors that would be uncontrollable. The monarch, for the first instance in his rule, started to envision an alternative path, one where custom could adapt and restoration might spring from the least expected successor. Yet what commenced as esteem was poised to transform into fate, and peril along with it. The determination was not reached openly. It was crafted in the stillness of the monarch's personal office, a space where eras had previously started and concluded. Charles convened his most loyal counselors, not to review governmental affairs, but to deliberate on the very continuation of the institution. The events that transpired past those imposing entrances were set to challenge allegiance, spark outrage, and initiate a strategy that might rescue the monarchy or shatter it irrevocably. The conferences commenced after the midnight hour, while the residents slumbered, and the hallways held just the resonance of solitary steps. Charles was positioned amidst a tight group, high-level consultants, clergy members, and faithful assistants who had assisted the dynasty for ages. Their topic of conversation was unimaginable: the notion of circumventing the customary order of precedence and bestowing the legendary title of Princess of Edinburgh not upon the expected successor, but to a young lady the public hardly recognized. The proposal itself was sufficient to stun the assembly, and the quiet that ensued was overwhelming. The archbishop was the initial one to express apprehension. How, he inquired, could this action be rationalized while not dismantling generations of monarchical custom? The institution, already damaged by decades of scandal and decay, was in no position to endure a further domestic insurrection. Yet Charles remained resolute. His voice was controlled, nearly aloof, as he talked of restoration, representation, and the need for a figure unmarked by controversy. He noted to the group that the institution was not currently battling external foes, but rather internal erosion. Custom, he stated quietly, is revered only when it fulfills a function. Not all were in agreement. Several worried that this maneuver would be viewed as partiality, a frantic effort to reshape the dynasty's trajectory. And this apprehension was felt most acutely by Camilla. Privately, she challenged the monarch with increasing dismay. She cautioned him that the press would distort the story, that appointing his niece might be perceived as a sentimental whim rather than a formal decree. You will face allegations of showing preference, and she will be leveraged to oppose you. Yet Charles's decision was firm. His goal was not centered on dynastic maneuvering, it was focused on salvation. Upon Edward's notification, the surprise was palpable. He had dedicated decades to silent allegiance, satisfied with his humble position, never anticipating his daughter's identity would ascend beyond the clamor of the monarchical structure. Briefly, he assumed it was a confusion, that Charles, perhaps, intended a symbolic token. Yet upon reviewing the text of the order, the seriousness became clear. His offspring was being presented not merely as a beacon of the times to come, but as the personification of a revised monarchical ideology, one set to reshape the definition of aristocracy. Personal discussions between the parent and child subsequently exposed Edward's internal struggle. Self-esteem battled apprehension. He respected his siblings' bravery, but feared the resulting tempest. However, under the uncertainty, a subtle awareness existed that this might be what Philip had perpetually envisioned, that the heritage of the Edinburgh title was designated to inspire, not just to be received. As the conversation intensified, a single reality started to solidify. This was not simply an issue of honors or custom. It was a manifestation of Charles's profound conflict, a sovereign caught between his predecessor's influence and the burden of his personal principles. In Lady Louise, he perceived not just stability, but also evolution, a signal that the institution might yet adapt rather than disintegrate. Thus, as the evening concluded, a secret provision was added to the text of the monarchical order, one guaranteeing her honor, once given, could not be revoked by societal or legislative demands. It represented a brilliant maneuver of monarchical planning and resistance in identical proportion. When the morning arrived, the signature was set, but so too was Charles's internal calm disturbed.
This was a paper unlike any other, secured with red sealant and marked with the monarchical insignia. As King Charles endorsed the momentous Edinburgh order, generations of custom yielded to one movement of his hand. Yet, concealed by that monarchical signature was a confidence that no proclamation could obscure. For this directive did not simply elevate a royal, it reshaped authority, lineage, and the essential spirit of the British crown. The formal proclamation, identified as the Edinburgh Restoration Act, was issued during the dawn of a tranquil spring day. Monarchical journalists, used to standard updates regarding functions and rituals, were caught entirely unprepared. The sovereign had proclaimed the resurrection of the historic Edinburgh, a designation not for an experienced royal or a primary successor, but for his youthful niece, Lady Louise Windsor. The news landed like a sudden shock. In a short time, the press environment exploded with disorientation, skepticism, and curiosity. Analysts hastened to interpret the intentions driving the action, every hypothesis more conjectural than the previous one. Did it stem from emotion, representation, or a significantly more strategic purpose? The reality, conversely, possessed origins extending much further into history and on to the monarch's moral awareness. Concealed in the text of the order was the impression of Prince Philip's foresight, a final desire the populace was never aware of. Within his last letters, Charles had found a private note written by his father. It was not an official paper, but a contemplation on heritage. In the message, Philip articulated his apprehension that the monarchy might eventually forfeit its core, that the institution would devolve into ritual lacking meaning. He conveyed his wish for the Edinburgh lineage to continue, not as an entitlement, but as a prompt regarding modesty and duty. May the honor, he penned, be founded not on arrogance, but on merit. That phrasing pursued Charles. It turned into his guide when everything else seemed ambiguous. However, inside the monarchical sphere, the response was far from respectful. Princess Anne, always dedicated to obligation, yet averse to shocks, challenged her sibling with incredulity. She disputed the sensibility of reviving this designation for an individual so youthful and unproven. William, while externally calm, allegedly expressed personal apprehension that society would view it as partiality, a determination steered by sentiment instead of calculation. Even Edward, conflicted by self-esteem and anxiety, found it difficult to grasp the full scale of his offspring's abrupt advancement. Every expression of adulation was tinged with foreboding. Beyond the palace entrance, the clamour intensified. Media outlets termed it the revival of a lost diadem, whereas analysts branded it Charles's high-stakes risk. Inquiries permeated the atmosphere. Why Louise? Why this moment? Was this a move toward adaptation or a disguised effort for salvation? For an institution founded on consistency, this action represented a seismic event. The established regulations had lost their sanctity, and the revised system was being drafted by a monarch apparently resolute in shattering generations of quiet. Yet under the display, this order held a more intimate quality, an admission clothed in ritual. For many observers, it represented Charles's effort to mend historical injuries,
to merge the spectres of his dynasty's history with the destiny they could not evade. He had existed in the presence of remorse, for the tense bond with his father, for the divisions among his sons, and for the times obligation required separation instead of warmth. In Louise, he perceived the naivety and focus his own era had forfeited. Honor or not, she signified a revitalization, not just of a designation, but of significance. However, despite endorsing the order with a firm grip, apprehension persisted, for concealed by each monarchical revival rests a silent insurrection. The sovereign had altered the past, yet, in the process, he had unlocked an entrance that could not be resealed. For each supporter who praised him as a pioneer, there existed individuals in his own lineage who perceived a different picture: treachery, partiality, and the perilous aroma of transformation. Yet, if Charles anticipated the order would unify his relatives, he misjudged the profound depths of monarchical envy. The Queen Consort's rage was immediate and alarming. Attendants present that day claim she destroyed a ceramic mug before speaking at all. To Camilla, the order represented beyond a monarchical adjustment. It was a danger, an emblem of her diminishing authority. And while she schemed quietly, a different lady, the forthcoming Queen Catherine, observed the situation progress with a serenity that masked a much more calculated mindset. In private, the residence transformed into a conflict zone, not involving troops, but resolve. Camilla challenged Charles with the intensity of a tempest finally unleashed. She insisted on understanding his reasoning for this massive determination without her input, why he would jeopardize their painfully built reputation, the fragile balance of influence they had dedicated decades to establishing, all for a young woman hardly recognized by the populace. "You have turned her into an icon," she alleged, her tone trembling with fury, "and icons possess authority, authority that might eventually oppose you." Charles, normally restrained, retorted with uncharacteristic resistance. He talked of restoration, of obligation, of his father's heritage. Yet under his statements lay remorse, a remorse she could detect and manipulate. Because Camilla had perpetually understood the monarch's primary vulnerability was not the media or the citizens, it was his compassion. Their union, previously a partnership of shared understanding, now exposed its fissures. The Queen Consort perceived her own displacement from the core, her authority weakened by emerging influences surrounding the sovereign. Sophie, loyal and dependable, and now Louise, whose naivety and ancestry had garnered societal empathy.
In an unprecedented way, Camilla sensed the foundation move below her, the established system dissolving. Her dread was not merely of falling from grace, but of becoming insignificant. Concurrently, Catherine watched quietly. The heir's wife had realized previously that the ultimate strength in the institution lay not in assertion, but in patience. Her quietness was not inaction, it was exactitude. While Camilla's fury raged, Catherine observed the fallout, aware that each error by the Queen Consort merely solidified her own silent rise. Assistants observed her poise at personal functions, her serene comfort to an anxious William, and her unwillingness to engage in rumors. She represented the direct opposite of turmoil, which rendered her the most formidable figure in the vicinity. Externally, the press started to intensify the situation. News reports divided the monarchical story into halves. Team Heritage, personified by Camilla and Princess Anne, protectors of the established system, opposing Team Change, guided by Charles, Sophie, and the recently designated Lady Louise. The purported unwilling princess saw societal views splinter. For each advocate who praised the choice as pioneering, another labeled it irresponsible. The monarchy, formerly the emblem of solidarity, now signified discord. Camilla, failing to manage the story, sought her associates, disseminating pieces of dissatisfaction via strategic contacts. Discreet accounts surfaced, murmurs regarding Charles's psychological fragility, about forces swaying the monarch. However, each effort to regain control merely generated further examination. The reputation she had dedicated years to restoring started to disintegrate, not due to controversy, but through public interpretation. Catherine, conversely, pursued a more patient strategy. She provided no comments, no viewpoints, yet her quietness was profoundly expressive. The citizenry started to perceive her as the stabilizing force during institutional turmoil, the embodiment of control and grace the crown urgently required. Beneath her calm exterior, nonetheless, she grasped precisely the events in progress. Authority was transitioning once more, not to Charles or Camilla, but to a destiny she discreetly personified. The institution was in conflict internally, not through declarations, but through insinuations. And as Camilla's fury resonated within Clarence House, in Windsor, a young lady readied herself to meet the public for the first instance as monarchy revitalized. This was not Westminster Abbey. This was not televised live internationally. Lady Louise's investiture occurred within the historic chambers of Holyrood, illuminated by tapers and quiet. It was a ritual hidden from lenses, yet fated to be recorded in lore. Observers subsequently murmured about a quivering hand, a drop of moisture on fabric, and a diadem previously held by a figure who challenged domains. And when the coronet grazed her brow, the past itself seemed to release its breath in reverence and apprehension. The determination to conduct the ritual in Scotland stunned even the most experienced monarchical analysts. Holyrood Palace, the centre of Scottish monarchy for ages, had not seen a comparable occasion in recent history. To Charles, it was representational, a conscious gesture of restoration, connecting modern times to the origins of the institution that existed before dominion, controversy, and statecraft. Yet, for the individuals within the residence, it surpassed representation. It was a proclamation. In selecting Holyrood rather than Westminster, the sovereign was clarifying that this investiture was not for display, it was for heritage. The attendees depicted the environment as hallowed, nearly ethereal. There were no broadcast teams, no international figures, no large parade. Just relatives, church officials, and a few observers who bore the weight of confidentiality. Rumor held that Charles personally required the ancient privileges, the lost pledges previously taken by Scottish sovereigns. Amid that quiet, Louise advanced, not as a monarchical youth, but as the personification of a foresight her grandfather envisioned well preceding her arrival. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, observed in silent astonishment. For decades, she had safeguarded her offspring from the harsh burden of societal demands. Presently, she could not defend her. All her maternal impulses pressed her to halt the ritual, to reverse the clock, to protect her child from the public scrutiny. Yet the time had passed. As the diadem was raised, her weeping revealed her self-esteem and her apprehension. Esteem for the individual her child had grown into, and dread for what that honor might require from her. While the traditional benediction was delivered and the chamber grew quiet, Louise murmured phrases nobody had prepared. "I shall respect his inheritance." The individuals nearest to her affirmed they perceived it, a vow directed not to Charles nor to the clergy,
but to her grandfather, Prince Philip, whose essence remained like a spectre in all parts of the room. The pledge resonated among the assembled group, bearing a significance that surpassed mere obligation. This was not simply the reception of a designation, it was submission to fate. As reports of the ritual eventually arrived in the wider public, the response was charged. A small number of exposed photographs, blurry, poorly illuminated, yet clearly monarchical, inundated online platforms rapidly. Princess of Edinburgh became a dominant topic internationally. Pundits discussed the confidentiality of the occasion. Experts disputed its political ramifications, and speculative ideas spread uncontrollably. Several alleged Charles had invested her against custom. Others murmured about a domestic dynastic agreement. For the populace, this was not merely an investiture, it was an enigma. And while the event was intended to represent solidarity, it conversely triggered apprehension. Under the acclaim, an undercurrent of skepticism started to move. For the past had demonstrated that any time a new authority emerges in the Windsor dynasty, darkness invariably ensues. Louise had transitioned beyond a royal. She had transformed into an icon.
And icons, as the institution has discovered repeatedly, can be perilous items. Yet not all were reveling, for in the darkness, established adversaries were currently engineering her collapse. The institution had endured conflicts, separations, and controversies, yet it had not previously confronted this situation. Within the residence's confines, strains erupted into murmurs of treachery. Prince William, traditionally prepared for continuity, perceived peril in his uncle's lineage ascending. Harry, observing from a distance, recognized a fitting retribution. And unprecedentedly in many years, the Windsor dynasty found itself fractured, not by external forces, but by its internal aspirations. As the report of Lady Louise's investiture emerged, it did not merely incite societal interest. It tore through the essential structure of the monarchical order. Within Kensington Palace, informants near Prince William asserted he was stunned by the sovereign's determination. Not involved, not alerted, simply notified after the order was endorsed and finalized. For William, the issue was not the designation itself. The issue was authority. He perceived in his uncle's branch a possible competitor to the meticulously curated heritage he was fated to receive. The institution, in his view, had perpetually centered on stability, foreseeable, deliberate, and intact. Yet Charles had just inserted a perilously erratic element, representation above inheritance, emotion above system. For Charles, the separation between himself and his sons had not previously seemed more vast. His connection with William had chilled to quietness, each interaction mediated by counselors and protocols. With Harry, the void was already immense, and presently this order, this defiance presented as custom, expanded both separations. Individuals near the monarch depicted him as fatigued yet determined. He felt he was molding the institution for endurance, not for display. Yet to his offspring it appeared he was altering the established regulations of the monarchy, and in that process violating every principle he previously vowed to protect. Harry, from the other side of the sea, ended his quiet in a short yet sharp discussion. Interrogated regarding his relative's abrupt assent, he smiled wryly and uttered just 5 words. Karma possesses a strange recollection. It was a type of comment crafted to wound without clarification. The media consumed it. Online platforms erupted with analyses. Was it a taunt aimed at William, at Charles,
or maybe at the establishment. Regardless of his intent, his statement exacerbated the injury. The siblings, previously joined by grief, now occupied contrary positions in the narrative. The press, detecting vulnerability, transformed the situation into a legend. News reports mentioned a fresh path of heritage. Analysts conjectured about a time when Louise's segment of the dynasty could eclipse William's. This was a story that sparked intense argument among monarchical followers. Was this the sovereign's subtle retaliation against the successor who had become remote, or his final effort to protect the institution from the inflexible destiny William embodied? Each image, every official engagement, turned into material for conjecture. Trapped in the center was Sophie, a parent divided by allegiance and affection. She had not pursued authority, nor desired control. Yet presently she was at the core of a monarchical tempest. Her dedication to Charles was authentic, but her apprehension for her child was equally real. She understood the monarchy's capacity to promote was accompanied by a more sinister ability, the capacity to destroy. Personally, she begged Charles to protect Louise from the mechanisms of the institution, but his comforting words seemed insincere. After the monarchy selected its representative, reversal was impossible. And regarding Louise, the youthful Princess of Edinburgh, the burden of her new designation started to overwhelm her. The thing that commenced as a privilege now seemed like a conflict zone. She could sense observation, not only from the populace, but from her own relatives. Her relatives' courteous expressions concealed silent bitterness. Her parents' backing was tinged with anxiety, and her grandfather's foresight had turned into a load she did not request to carry. In her solitary reflections, she started to question if she represented solidarity or the catalyst for discord. The Windsor dynasty had endured generations of tempests, but this was distinct. This was an internal rupture, unseen, yet monumental. Each discussion held strain. Every official action was laden with hidden significance. The institution was disintegrating, not through controversy or banishment, but quietly. Yet precisely when the monarchical household appeared poised to shatter irreparably, destiny introduced a development none anticipated.
Philip's communication was not an expression of emotion or reminiscence. It was an admission, a contemplation, and a prediction. He penned his anxieties for the institution, of the widening gap separating obligation and feeling, and of the peril that arises when aspiration masks itself as intention. His script wavered somewhat, yet his belief was unambiguous. Lineage, integrity, responsibility, not aspiration. The phrase landed like a thunderbolt. For decades, the relatives had been absorbed by the drive for authority, for reputation, for power. Yet Philip's statement served as a prompt that the institution's continuation relied not on supremacy, but on dedication. While Charles recited the text, the animosity that had separated them started to ease. In a brief instant, parent and children, siblings, competitors, and partners were all united by the resonance of a single individual's insight. Even William, his expression previously fixed in quiet opposition, averted his eyes. As he eventually raised his head, his parent perceived an emotion absent for ages: comprehension. For Louise, the disclosure resonated more profoundly. She understood in that moment her investiture was never focused on authority. It was focused on protection. The Edinburgh designation, previously assumed to be her legacy, was actually her grandfather's ultimate trial. Her selection was not for command, but for recollection, to personify the modesty and determination the institution had almost lost. Her diadem was equally an icon and a judgment, a pledge to maintain obligation even when it required concessions. And with that awareness, she grasped her grandfather's long-standing intention. The burden of the past is not borne by the individuals who pursue it, but by the individuals selected for it. The atmosphere within Balmoral transformed that evening. Past grievances dissipated, perhaps temporarily, supplanted by an unknown feeling: solidarity. It was delicate, transient, yet authentic. Unprecedentedly, Charles sensed that maybe his father's essence had reappeared, not to critique him, but to direct him. He regarded Louise and perceived not insurrection, but salvation. The institution, despite its divisions, had discovered its likeness in one gesture of recollection. And while the gales roared across the Scottish Highlands, a concluding proclamation would guarantee this narrative achieved immortality. In an existence torn between custom and advancement, the monarchy located its connection: a young lady with a subdued tone and a revitalized designation. Lady Louise, Princess of Edinburgh, faced a populace that had questioned her, and she smiled, not with authority, but with intention. Unprecedentedly in many years, the institution's narrative was not focused on controversy or grief. It was focused on restoration, and the young woman who bore its optimism. As Louise entered the societal view for the initial instance as Princess of Edinburgh, the globe paused in anticipation. Her tone, gentle yet firm, delivered a communication that surpassed mere ritual. She articulated not on ancestry or entitlement, but on obligation, empathy, and endurance. "We are not bequeathed responsibility," she stated. "We select it daily with dignity." That phrasing resonated throughout the country, a subdued proclamation of the institution's potential in an era craving genuinity. At that juncture, she did not merely renew trust in the establishment, she reshaped it. The monarch observed from the sidelines, his look laden with esteem and contemplation. In a maneuver that astonished even his most intimate assistants, Charles subsequently commanded a fresh painting to be displayed in Buckingham Palace, one positioning Lady Louise alongside the departed Queen Elizabeth II. For numerous observers, it was representational, almost predictive. The Queen had personified obligation refined. Louise personified obligation revitalized. The pair of images, positioned together, emerged as the visible manifestation of stability and transformation. The institution's perpetual conflict between its past identity and its necessary evolution. Societal feeling started to move in a manner no monarchical planner could have orchestrated. Ratings increased, censure lessened, and unprecedentedly in decades, the monarchical household turned into a narrative of solidarity instead of division. The media, previously unceasing in its examination, was suddenly neutralized by genuinity. Louise's modesty stood in stark opposition to the clamor of contemporary celebrity. She articulated minimally, functioned discreetly, and behaved as though conscious that each action might restore or damage. Her demeanor soothed what decades of scandal had aggravated. For the populace, she was not merely a royal, she was a pledge. From this metamorphosis arose what chroniclers subsequently termed the Edinburgh Doctrine. It was King Charles's ultimate foresight for the institution. It represented an ideology, not an order.
that authority requires equilibrium with compassion, and tradition must benefit the populace, not its own ends. In addresses and behaviors, Charles stressed this revitalized intention, an institution focused less on diadems and more on morality. And at the core of this ideology was Louise, the personification of all her grandfather had envisioned and her uncle had ventured to reinstate. Inside the dynasty, deeply hidden strains eased into a tense calm. William and his parent exchanged wary grins that suggested a potential rapprochement. Sophie's gaze, frequently marked by anxiety, presently gleamed with subdued esteem. Even the individuals who previously questioned the sovereign's selection felt moved by the outcome. In a fleeting instant, the Windsor dynasty seemed complete once more. Its divisions mended, not through authority, but through dignity. But under the victory, darkness persisted. For each diadem, regardless of its dignity, bears a price. Louise had received not only a designation, but a load. The demands of a populace, the heritage of an institution, and the murmurs of observers anticipating her failure. The narrative of her era had merely commenced, and accompanying it was the inquiry that would shape her fate. Thus, the chronicle concludes not with an investiture, but with an interrogation.